Okay, well, time to start. So, hello, welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Alistair Roth. I'm Executive Director at AII Victoria. So, a very warm welcome to members of the AIIA, to our other guests, and to members of the Diplomatic Corps joining us. We'll run the talk for about 40 minutes or so, and we'll take questions after that. So please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A tab in the toolbar as usual. So to discuss the topic of the power of the Pope in global affairs, it's a pleasure to welcome Professor Francis Campbell. Francis is the Vice Chancellor of the University of Notre Dame in Sydney. He's currently over in WA, has a fascinating background in diplomacy and policy and academia. So he joined the UK Foreign Commonwealth Office in 1997. He's worked at the UN Security Council, at the European Union, and various diplomatic postings. From 1999 to 2003, he served on the staff of then Prime Minister Tony Blair as policy advisor in the number 10 policy unit and as private secretary to the Prime Minister. He was on secondment to Amnesty International as the senior director of policy. And then another diplomatic postings, well, from 2005 to 2011, ambassador to the Holy See, deputy high commissioner in Pakistan for a couple of years, and on to other senior roles at the FCO, before moving to academia, 4 years vice chancellor of St Mary's University in London and professor of international relations, and now here to University of Notre Dame. So Patrick, Francis, thank you so much for joining us. I'll hand over to you and I'll see you at the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you for the invitation to address the Australian Institute of International Affairs. So the topic you've given me for this evening's discussion is the power of the Pope in global affairs. So I'd like to basically use the time that I have with you really to say, firstly, a little bit about the structure of the Holy See, which is a sovereign entity with which the Pope, from which the Pope operates with the governance of the Catholic Church. And then to go through really from probably, and I have to confess, it's probably a UK perspective, a UK diplomatic perspective, but I think it's common to certainly most Western states as to how they view the Holy See. How do we reduce it to really strong foreign policy indicators or diplomatic indicators? How do you translate it into the world of realpolitik? And then finally, really to say something about the popes themselves, because structure is part of the response, but structure doesn't tell the whole story. As with any office, religious or political office, huge amount rests on the personality and the attributes of the individuals. So I'll probably focus on three popes, John Paul II, who was Pope from 1978 till 2005, Benedict XVI from 2005 to 2013, and now Pope Francis from 2013 to the present. So let me start by just saying the following, and there's 6 points that I'll address around structure and diplomacy. So firstly, what is the Holy See? I would sort of boil it down to four things. It's something that's both global and local. It's something that is a respected interlocutor. It's something that is a global opinion former. And it's something that is a hybrid of a sovereign power and a religion. Now, in international terms and in terms of sovereignty, the Holy See predates the creation of sovereign nation states. So if you wished to get something in international law that correlates with the Holy See, in a system like Australia, you would think of the Crown. In the case of the Crown's relationship with the Holy See, it dates from 1479. It's the foundation of the Crown's diplomatic relationship. It's the first overseas ambassador that the Crown sent abroad, and they sent former Bishop of Durham to Rome. The Portuguese and the Spanish were there before, but it is the very foundation. And the relationship is with the Holy See. As you know, with the break in Rome and the break with the relations around Henry VIII and the Reformation, Elizabeth I tried to re-establish in the first year of her reign, tried to re-establish sovereign relations. That didn't come to pass. And you had then subsequently, with the reunification of Italy, you had the loss of papal lands, etc. Britain restored diplomatic relations around the time of the First World War. This predated the creation of the Vatican City state, and often in diplomacy there is a confusion between the relationship between the Vatican City state and the Holy See. The Vatican City state did not come into being until 1929, and it's the bilateral treaty between the then Italian state and the papacy. But the diplomatic relations which the Holy See has, which there are 183 countries today, is with the Holy See. The Vatican City state is simply the territorial base. You do not actually need a territorial base to have that sovereign recognition, and that was the case in relation to the United Kingdom. You have an entity that touches around a sixth of the world's population. You have something that is global in that 17.5, 18% of the world's population identifies as Catholic. High concentrations in particular parts of the world. But here is something that is global. But you also have something that is very, very local. So in relation to a diplomatic relationship for, say, the United Kingdom, or indeed in the case of Australia, you have something that relates to individuals in a minister's constituency. So with MPs and representative ministers or politicians, you have something that is very local, linked to a local church, to a local school, to a local hospital. And yet here is something that is very global. So even in that foreign policy space, it's hybrid, it's both domestic politics and it's global. In relation to the respected interlocutor, it is an entity that has a vast diplomatic network of papal nuncios who are the equivalent of ambassadors or high commissioners in each country. They're clerics, and they have a dual function. One of their functions is a very particular relationship to the Catholic Church as the representative of the Pope to the local Catholic Church. They have a crucial role in advising the papacy on the appointment of bishops in a particular country. But they're also accredited to the sovereign power, so they also fulfill a normal diplomatic function. And depending on the individual that holds the office, some will put a greater emphasis on perhaps the intra-religious dimension with regards to the Catholic Church. Others will play a very, very particular role with regarding the politics. And for example, I would cite the role of a previous nuncio that was in Lebanon during the Civil War, Pablo Puente, a Spaniard, who played a very, very particular and unique role in the negotiation around the Lebanese peace process and the subsequent constitution that emerged there. In addition to that, the papacy has a very, very respected role with regards to other faith groups. It's got a convening power, in particular with the Abrahamic faiths. And you can see that, even as far back as 1986, when John Paul II had the Assisi Day of Prayer, gathering together the world's faith communities in just this really respected global convening power, bringing together different parts of humanity. And that is something that has continued during the subsequent pontificates of Benedict XVI and Pope Francis. But there is this real respected interlocutor that some countries, in particular, I could think of one very large Islamic country that had the second biggest number of diplomats accredited to the Holy See resident in Rome. I still believe that country still has a very significant number of diplomats in their embassy. And they saw the papacy as a window to the Western world, as a moral conscience, as something to which they could appeal, where religion was understood. So this notion that somehow the diplomatic relationships that the Holy See possesses are simply Catholic or Christian ones is really a mistake. This is something that those countries where religion really matters, where perhaps there isn't as sharp a distinction between religion, state, and society, as you might find in the West, these countries place a huge emphasis on the relationship with the Holy See. So it's there, that constant sort of respected international and domestic interlocutor. Then you have the role of the global opinion former. And whether one agrees with the Holy See or not, whether one agrees with what the Pope says or not, the office of the papacy is instantly recognizable. So I would bring you back to 2003, prior to the war and invasion in Iraq. And you saw in that February of 2003, you saw a flurry of activity going into Rome to see John Paul II, who at that stage was quite ill. But you saw Tariq Aziz, you saw Colin Powell, you saw Tony Blair, you saw de Villepin, the French foreign minister. You saw a huge amount of activity going in because you had someone who was in the West geographically, but acting as a global voice and a whole sort of voice of restraint. And Kofi Annan in that period as well, and the links between the UN Secretary General and the Pope, really looking for all avenues of peace. So again, you have somebody that is a global opinion former, that immediately, whether one agrees or not, commands attention on the basis of the office they hold. It's an internationally recognizable office. You have a huge press corps that travels with the Pope when he goes abroad on visits. And it's something that when the office speaks, attention is given. I would cite as well, I can think of, for example, again, in the UK sense, where around 10% of the British population identify as Catholic. You would have perhaps 20% in Scotland, about 45% in Northern Ireland, and then perhaps around 9 or 10% in England, and maybe, I think, 3 or 4% in Wales. But again, when the state visit of Benedict XVI occurred in September 2010, it was like no state visit that we had ever seen in the United Kingdom in recent times, because it wasn't just the pomp and pageantry and the sui generis nature of a state visit of a pope. It was the fact that it involved the domestic movement of hundreds of thousands of our own citizens and the major policing operation that goes with that. And in fact, the dry run for us was what took place in Australia and Sydney in 2008 in World Youth Day. But again, it illustrates both the global role of this office, but also the global and the local role. And then of the fourth characteristic that I would say that we would use to translate something like the Holy See into a diplomatic language or foreign policy language, it's a hybrid of a sovereign power and a religion. So it's very difficult in some senses to translate it into nation-state architecture, because it is the governance of the Catholic Church. Its structure in Rome is a structure that anyone familiar with the latter phases of the Roman Empire would understand, with a Senate or a College of Cardinals, 120, etc. And this is something that, in terms of its longevity alone, and I always used to think of this when I was a student in the United States. I studied alongside, I didn't study business, but I studied alongside people who were studying for business degrees. And they were always looking at longevity and success of businesses. And they would be thinking of, General Electric at that time. Microsoft was emerging, and we didn't yet have Google's. But they never sort of thought of, well, here is something that either in longevity or market share is the Catholic Church that has survived invasions, sackings, occupations, and yet it has this uninterrupted structure and has a form of sovereignty that predates the modern system. So it sits in the United Nations as a observer, but as an observer with sovereign power. It's voluntarily there as an observer. Like Switzerland, up until I think somewhere in the last 20 years, Switzerland also sat as an observer because Switzerland did not wish to compromise its neutrality. And similarly, the Holy See didn't want to compromise its neutrality. So its presence in the United Nations is not a qualification on its lack of sovereignty, because 183 countries have diplomatic relations with the Holy See. It's there really voluntarily, because by being an observer, it doesn't have to vote on particular issues. It remains neutral. Now, we then move into, well, what do you do with the Holy See? How do you operate with it as a sovereign power, as a, perhaps, dare I say, secular power? You approach it really bilaterally and multilaterally, because in essence, it's a multilateral entity. It's staffed with a variety of nationalities. So it's like the UN Secretariat, or it's like the European Commission. It's got many nationalities, but it's got one difference, in my view, and the difference is that there is a single dominant culture. And that single dominant culture is the Italian culture, to which the different members of the Vatican civil service are enculturated. They often go to Rome early on to do their studies. If they become diplomats, they follow a 2-year program in a residential diplomatic academy in the center of Rome. But they are integrated into a single Italian culture. And I think that actually, in my view, having seen the UN Secretariat and having seen the European Commission, I think that single culture actually helps the effectiveness of the Holy See and its civil service, otherwise known as the Roman Curia. In relation to, say, for example, the United Kingdom's diplomatic relations, as I say, there's a mixture of bilateral and multilateral. But what was the reason that the United Kingdom in the 20th century decided to reopen relations? Really, it was driven by 3 areas of the world and also by the First World War. The 3 areas of the world at the time were what was happening in Quebec, what was happening in Ireland, and what was happening in Malta. So 3 Catholic areas of Britain's, either at that stage in the Irish case, part of the United Kingdom, but with the 1916 Rising, the subsequent War of Independence, etc. So the United Kingdom opens diplomatic relations in 1916. And you have those 3 questions, Quebec, Ireland, and Malta, very much to the fore of Britain's diplomatic representatives. You then move after the sort of perhaps a settling of those issues, you then sort of go into a bit of a lull, and then you have the rise of fascism in Italy and National Socialism in Germany. And then the embassy to the Holy See takes on a very, very sharp, unique, and distinct role, because the diplomatic representative at that time, Sir Darcy Osborne, decides rather than to leave Rome, the government leaves him in Rome, but he moves inside the Vatican City state, and he's in there until the liberation of Rome. And it's a constant source of tension. There is a lot of pressure from the German authorities to try to put pressure on the Italian authorities to violate the Holy See's sovereignty and to go in and seize him, etc. But again, during the war, there is a very sharp focus in Whitehall around the value of the Holy See as a listening post. So I come back to this global and local. Here is an entity that has a universal spread, the like of which we as a foreign ministry normally wouldn't come across. So prior to Google, prior to the internet, you have a red book that really has a link through to all the Catholic agencies, bishops, dioceses across the world globally. So you are one or two steps removed from accessing information on a local area in a pre-digital age. When it comes to the Second World War, you have Darcy Osborne inside the Vatican getting a variety of global pieces of information, which he is able to, a certain extent, feedback to Rome or feedback to London, but the church is getting information. Now, this has been chronicled for anyone who wants to read this. Professor Owen Chadwick produced a book on this, Britain and the Vatican during the Second World War, and he was the Regius Chair of History at Cambridge. But fascinating use of the archives during this period and a fascinating insight to the role of the papacy in the Second World War. A lot of attention subsequently focused on how much the papacy knew, for example, about what was happening in Central and Eastern Europe with the extermination camps and whether that information was coming out and how was it verified, etc. And that there is dealt with in large part in that book, but also the way that the Holy See actually used its offices with the then British representatives to get people through the Holy See, through the Vatican City state, with new identities and out. So it's a part of the process that begins to listen into the Holy See as a listening post. Now, people will say it's one of the world's great listening posts because of that global presence and what you hear. And I saw that many times. I wouldn't over-egg it because I think whilst it gets a lot of information, the difference between that and perhaps more sophisticated Western government with technical capacity in this field is the processing speed is not there to the same extent. So you have this hybrid of a sovereign power sitting in diplomatic arena, but it's also world religion. So those four characteristics would be the way that I would translate something of the Holy See into a more secular power construct of why we would have diplomatic relations. So that is a combination of the global and the local, a respected interlocutor, a global opinion former, and a hybrid of state, a hybrid of sovereign power and a religion. Fulfilling bilateral policies and fulfilling multilateral policies. We move, in the UK's case, beyond the Second World War, we move into the Cold War. And again, we see during the Cold War that the Holy See provides a very unique platform for Western foreign ministries to get an insight into what is happening in what was then called Church of Silence. So what was happening behind the Iron Curtain, both in Catholic countries, but also with regards to the predominantly Orthodox Christian countries, and including within the Soviet Union and Russia and Ukraine. So churches, Orthodox churches underground or controlled by the state, different situations in different Catholic countries across Central and Eastern Europe. But again, a flow of information coming out to the Holy See, and you would see a variety of diplomats analyzing that and what is happening with regards to religious freedom, and where religious freedom sits on a continuum around human rights and what it tells us about what the attitude is to human dignity, to human rights, and any prospect of democratic freedom, or how the local population is actually dealing or handling communism? Is it embraced? How far is the revolution getting hold? What degree of passive resistance is there in the state, etc.? So through the Cold War, that again, a massive listening post, huge focus in Central and Eastern Europe. And then you begin the end of the Cold War and you move then into what I would describe as multilateralism. So the multilateralism is, again, what are the areas you leverage? Disarmament. And again, people might say, well, 107 acres of the Vatican City state, the Swiss Guard, hardly to the forefront of the world's disarmament efforts. But I bring you back to the global opinion former. I bring you back to the moral and ethical voice. I bring you back to grassroots motivation, action. So for things like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, for things like the Arms Trade Treaty, for things like cluster munitions. So for cluster munitions or the Arms Trade Treaty in particular, this would be something where domestic churches, the Catholic Church operating on an ecumenical basis with other Christian denominations, building a domestic caucus, using groups like Caritas and development agencies or justice and peace networks. But for a foreign ministry, you have access to something that is both domestic and foreign, and you can mobilize it beyond your own borders. If you can get an endorsement from the papacy in Rome, all of a sudden your foreign policy has a reach way beyond what it would normally have in a bilateral setting, but you're also able to affect domestic thinking in somebody else's country. So one area was disarmament. Another area for I served 3 prime ministers in the role of the Holy See, 2 Labour, 1 Conservative. All 3 had a huge effort around the G8 and the G20 in relation to debt relief and in relation to different initiatives around education for all and health. And for example, when the rotating presidency of either the G20 or what's now the G7, back to the G7, when a country perhaps, I could think of one European country that didn't have debt relief to the fore of its agenda. And the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, had a very good idea that we might ask Benedict XVI, who was, as you know, German, to perhaps get involved domestically with that country that had the G8 presidency at that time. And the effect of that was that debt relief actually went to the top of the agenda of that country's G8 presidency. And that was by leveraging pressure from inside, using the domestic policy and the constituency that's there at home. So with regards to international development, another major area of development policy, not only the moral concept and the moral dimension of the Holy See and what it brings to bear in international development. So for example, the UK government had a huge lobbying exercise around creating the moral argument for countries, for the developed countries, to be committing 0.7% of gross national product to international development. But equally, the fact that in the least developed countries, the capacity that is there on the ground in health and education is actually in the hands of the Catholic Church. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, roughly 50% of health capacity in sub-Saharan Africa is in the hands of religious groups. So to achieve what was then the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals, you had to use the power of the faith groups to achieve a social end. Equally with regards to education, each day 66 million children will attend Catholic schools. And again, in many parts of the least developed countries, the only option, the only functioning option is a faith-based school, in large part a Catholic school. So from an international development point of view, the church is both a moral voice, but a practical actor on the ground. And that was something that we in our development ministry at the time always was cognizant of. The final multilateral area that I just mentioned is the whole area of the environment and climate change. And again, this was something, coming from deep roots in relation to a Christian theology of ecology, but actually beginning to change and frame the argument and beginning to raise the prospect. And you saw that very particularly coming out during Benedict XVI's time as Pope, but increasingly with an entire papal encyclical, which is a teaching document, Laudato Si, coming from Pope Francis, with a very specific action plan and encouraging governments and encouraging international action at the UN level, but also at state level, but also down to grassroots, parishes, schools, families, and linking in with groups like Caritas Internationalis, which is about a 178 member federation, of which Caritas Australia is but one part. So again, you have the practical convening power, tackling individual action around responsible living and a simple life, but also delivering the message at a more global level. So we have 9 minutes left. Let me just talk about the office holders, because structure, as I said at the start, gives you a particular meaning, but really personality of the office, the attributes of the leaders. And in the 3 cases that I talk about, John Paul II, elected in 1978, surprise candidate, very young for the papacy, coming from the Church of Silence, coming from Poland, Archbishop of Krakow. And up to that point, the Vatican had tried a policy of Ostpolitik towards the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that were in the Warsaw Pact. It was very keen to find an accommodation through an agreement that would allow the church to appoint bishops. But the communist authorities in many of those countries wanted to control who was being appointed as the bishop or the religious leader. And here arose, and it arises today in some parts of the world, a real tension, which pulls at the string of the sovereign power and the religious faith. And it's a distinction or a pull between pragmatism and the prophetic voice. So the religious voice will pull you towards being prophetic. The diplomatic voice will pull you towards pragmatism. So you had a real debate going on in the life of the Vatican at that time. Do we do a deal with the communist regimes, which will allow us to appoint bishops? Or do we not do a deal and put the church completely underground where we won't have bishops and therefore the sacramental life of the church won't function? So John Paul arrives, and John Paul brings a real grassroots domestic view of the fragility of Polish communism and of communism across Central and Eastern Europe. And within 1 year of being elected Pope in October 78, he is in Warsaw, in Victory Square in Warsaw. And you see the convening power of the papacy, something that the communist regime of Poland could not do. They could not convene numbers on that scale, and yet they couldn't keep him out. And you have the whole rise of solidarity. So you have someone who is speaking at that particular moment, at a very particular context, to a Europe that is divided in a world where the Cold War is very live and very active. But this global figure occupying the papacy is coming from these communist lands, from a country that has experienced in his lifetime the end of the imperial age, a brief nationalist period, then the Second World War and the occupation by Germany, then the communism and the Warsaw Pact. So you have all these isms that this individual has grown up with and has experienced, but is bringing this in to a key position of world leadership. And you see the correspondence now, from the Thatcher archive, and you see some of it from the Reagan library, of the traffic back and forward during that period between Western governments and the papacy, wanting to know what was going on in Poland at that particular time with the rise of solidarity, and really listening to a grassroots judgment about the fragility of that regime. Now, if you believe that Poland was the first domino to go in Central and Eastern Europe, and it started roughly around 1980 or 1981, you would have to say that John Paul is one of the key figures in that sort of 1980s collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe, along with Gorbachev, and along with the latter developments then in Hungary and in East Germany, and also with regards to the rhetoric and the build-up of Ronald Reagan, etc. So there's a number of key actors in that space, of which John Paul II is one. You then move to Benedict, German, slightly younger than John Paul II, but again coming out of a Second World War experience as a teenager, but very much sort of focused on the crisis between faith and reason in Western Europe and in the West in general, and the Enlightenment, very much an academic and an intellect, but focused on the nature of secularism and the relationship between faith and the state and society. And perhaps, if you look at his dialogue with Jürgen Habermas before he became Pope, two key academics talking in Munich in around 2003 in a really prophetic space about some of the tensions that we now see playing out in Western society around the role of religion, around the role of socialization in society, the democratic bonds that are needed to keep communities together. These are all vital things that are going on, and that Joseph Ratzinger, as a theologian, is talking to Habermas about. And I read it, and I've reread that text many, many times, and they both are alive to the risk that our Western societies sort of atomize and, in a sense, become Hobbesian, that there is a war of subjective rights. Ratzinger, as Benedict XVI, then resigns in 2013, the first pope to do so in many centuries. And then there is elected the first Latin American pope, Pope Francis. A very different style, a very different appeal. In many respects, some of the global attributes that you see in John Paul II, but for very different reasons and in a very different context. And Pope Francis is talking about a more simple type of leadership. He's talking about ecology. He's talking about a place of faith. He's got an internal agenda around the church and the Vatican and reform, but he's also got an external agenda, which is talking about perhaps some of the weaknesses in the Western system, about the distance between the elected and the voters. Some of the gaps in society and the increasing inequalities in wealth, issues around migration, issues around trafficking, and beginning to talk to some of the sort of societal issues and the societal tensions that are facing Western societies and a lack of cohesion. So he brings a very simple, dare I say, aspects of an Argentinian polity to the office of the papacy, but it's nonetheless a challenging one. And it's a challenging one, especially in the West, when we are beginning to see sort of certain types of stronger leader where it's built around a personality and a power and a greater distance between the ordinary citizen and those who occupy positions of power. So there is a critique there that he is giving that is driven by humility and is speaking to an answer and need of society. So there's three different popes coming from three different cultural experiences. One embodying a very particular point in time towards the end of the Cold War, who played a pivotal role in bringing it to an end. A pope coming out of the German theological tradition that basically is focused more on the writing, but perhaps is prophetic about some of the issues we're facing in Western society and some of the challenges. And then Pope Francis, that is coming from a Latin American experience and from the South, really challenging some of the debates that are taking place in Western Europe and in the United States and in the Western countries around solidarity and a need for a reinvigoration of society. All three, in a way, sort of perhaps gravitating around that interwar debate between Toynbee and Spengler around the renewal of society, with somebody saying, look, Spengler saying the Western concept is like any other civilization. It's had its rise, it's had its dominance, it will have its demise. And Toynbee arguing from an Anglican Christian perspective in that interwar period, saying, no, it's different because it's had this longevity, because religion acts as a renewal, acts as a creative minority in the distance. And I think those three characters as popes have used the office differently to do different things, but nonetheless, in my view, they have illustrated the global and the local. They've illustrated the respected interlocutor, and they've illustrated that it's a hybrid of sovereign power and a religion, and that they've also formed global opinion to various degrees. So I will stop there, Alistair. I think I've done my 40 minutes.
that was excellent. Thank you so much for it. You've shed a lot of light on a subject that I think is not well known to a lot of us, and it's been really detailed coverage. We got some questions. I've got a couple too, so I'll just pitch them in. I was very interested in, what you were saying about their role as a respected interlocutor, and the reference to Iraq in 2003 with the visits there. I'm assuming that wasn't those different parties at the same time, or was there a role of trying to broker a peace deal between them, or was this separate consultations or exchange of views?
So in some cases, there was about an hour between the meetings. So some people were being held, the Italian police were circling the Vatican in convoys to make sure that there wasn't any sort of embarrassing meeting in corridors. The Holy See will always put its good offices at the disposal of various parties. But it's got, because of its global presence, it's got vulnerabilities on the ground. So it always has to be very careful of its actions, because the first backlash will often be against believers. So in the case of Iraq, you have Eastern Rite Catholic churches, ancient Christian churches in the region. So when the Pope speaks, he always has to be mindful and careful that the consequences could be delivered on somebody within a very short space of time. So whilst it's global, you always have to say to Western powers, they have a reach here and a vulnerability, but a strength and a vulnerability at the same time. But I can think, John Paul II, for example, did send a peace envoy to the White House. He sent Cardinal Pio Laghi, who had previously been a papal nuncio during the time of George Bush Sr. Mm-hmm. And he sent him to the White House. And the White House was worried because of the sheer size of the American Catholic Church, which numbers around 75 million people. And religion, if for those of you that follow American politics, you can see, going down that Midwest, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the whole way down to Florida, that vote is a swing vote. So It can have domestic considerations, but in Piolagi's case, it didn't have an effect.
That's interesting. And you talked about the Cold War, and that's obviously got implications now, I suppose, with what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, to take the point of the neutrality, I suppose the Pope is not able to take a position on whether someone has breached international law or the UN Charter. Is that right? But given I suppose also with Putin's moving towards the Orthodox Church and using that for his own, what role do you think the Pope could have to play with the Ukraine conflict?
Well, again, when Putin invaded Ukraine, and this is something that is very characteristic of Pope Francis. Whoever drove him in this little Fiat that he drives around in, he pops into the Russian ambassador to the Holy See. He goes to see him. So all protocol is thrown out the window, but he goes in to see an ambassador and spends an hour and a half with the ambassador. Now, Ukraine is a very complex space for the Vatican because of the overlay of religious identification and geography. Mm-hmm. So you have 4 groups. So in Eastern Ukraine, you have an Orthodox community that looks to Moscow, the Moscow Patriarch, rather than to Constantinople. You then, moving further west, you have a Ukrainian Orthodox Church that split away from Moscow following the collapse of the Soviet Union, that now looks for its primacy to Constantinople, but has a patriarch in Kiev. Then from the 17th century, you have the Greek Rite Catholics, which is an Orthodox community that comes under Rome. And then you move further to the west to around Lviv, where it is a Latin Rite, Polish, what would have been a Polish Catholic community from the time when the borders were moved following the Second World War, and the borders were moved westwards. So you have 4 different religious groups, and the overlay of that on the politics and what we're seeing at the moment in Ukraine is perhaps understated, that there is a correlation between what's happening and who looks to which direction. So the Vatican has an ecumenical problem. It has to navigate the relationship with the Russian Patriarch, and what do you do with Orthodoxy? And then it's got a political problem as well. But it's very clear, the Pope has been very clear in his message about the illegality of the invasion, but at the same time, wanting to ensure that religious or ecumenical relations with the Orthodox world are not fractured, and that this wouldn't become a religious war.
Mm-hmm. You talked that the papal nuncios are out there as the diplomatic representatives and lobbying, I suppose. When the Pope actually visits a country in his own right, clearly there's a huge impact there, and you see it with the crowds who turn out. How is it decided where he might go, and what's the agenda around those visits?
So it depends on whether it's a pastoral visit or a state visit. He very rarely goes on a state visit. He did go to the United Kingdom on a state visit because the Queen invited. Once they say they're coming. So a government would invite, right, but it's usually around, there has to be a domestic religious dimension as well. And they will assess probably 3 times a year. It depends again on the particular Pope, but usually around 3 times a year, possibly a visit to the United Nations General Assembly to give a speech, etc. But you're talking about a year of planning, because the security costs and the security nightmare that goes with this, because it's not like any state visit. So even in the case of the UK, where 10% of the population, as I said, are Catholic, we're talking about events involving, 250,000 people lining the Mall. Yep. And the policing operation that goes with that. And a lot of this is spontaneous. Some of it can be planned in big stadiums, but other parts of it on the street. And then there is a government dimension to this. But again, there is a difference, I would say, between predominantly Catholic countries that might have a more sentimental relationship with the Holy See. Somewhere like the United Kingdom, you have to look for value for money. And I dare say Australia would be the same. So you have to focus on the multilateral. You have to align it to your foreign ministry's interests. You have to be reporting on the Ukraine. You have to be reporting on all of those bilateral relationships, and then also the multilateral delivery that you need to do.
We haven't talked about China, but I suppose because the part of the world we're in, we should. What's your assessment of the relationship there with China? With respect to human rights, for example.
So Alistair, it's a fascinating and complex area for the Holy See. The parallel would be the Ostpolitik of Central and Eastern Europe. The same problem arises and the same tension between the prophetic voice, and on the prophetic voice, you would place, for example, Cardinal Zen, the former cardinal in Hong Kong, who himself, I think, was born in Shanghai. And Cardinal Zen's view would be no deal should be done because of the underground church, is the faithful church. The official patriotic church is under state control. The Vatican position at the moment is that there is an agreement with Beijing around the appointment of bishops. And it's usually, the way these things often work, the full detail of this is never always published, but from Vietnam, you might get an indication of what it's like, that a list is produced of agreed names, but the actual final decision is taken by Rome. Now, none of this, either with China or with Central and Eastern Europe, is new. In many respects, it's a rerun of the investiture crisis in the Middle Ages. Who has the right to appoint a bishop? Somebody in Rome or the local ruler? The difference being that it's not a predominantly Christian society or country. In relation to China, there's two things, I think. One is the attitude to a foreign power, as they would see a foreign power having some say. Secondly, there is the case studies of what happened in Poland. So they're looking at Central and Eastern Europe, and they're seeing the role that the Catholic Church and religion played in Central and Eastern Europe, and they're extrapolating from there. But fundamentally, there's a real tension at the heart of the Vatican's or the Holy See's diplomatic posture on this. The prophetic voice, as espoused by Cardinal Zen, or the more pragmatic diplomatic dimension that some Vatican diplomats would espouse. Cardinal Zen's critique is you will eventually discredit yourself because you will do a deal and it will not enliven the church. And probably in that regard, he's probably closer to John Paul II, in my view. But it's a very different context. There's similarities and there are differences, but they've gone down the route of the pragmatic diplomatic deal, but it's not without its tensions.
That's just a question on the Zoom. If the case, this is looking ahead, if the number of practicing Catholics in developed nations is declining, I think it might be. Is that likely to affect the Vatican's political power in the future? Do you think it's still going to?
It could, but it's rising. It's in developed countries. So the majority of the church, so it's declining in Europe. But it comes back to the fact, and again, this was an illustration. Britain is a highly secular country. In constitutional terms, it's got a role for an established church, but it's a highly secular country. And I saw in 2010, the build-up to the papal visit was very negative. And literally, as the Pope arrived in the streets of Edinburgh, the BBC changed because they were thinking, where are all these people coming from? So, they had a view of the Catholic Church that it was white and elderly. But what you saw on the streets was a church really that you would find in the cathedrals. It's a church of immigrants. It's interesting what's happened. Like, you know, I think in the 1930s, the church had, the Vatican or the Holy See had diplomatic relations with around 35 countries. And now it has relations with 183. So there's a massive increase. Part of it, you know, if you take Australia, where the Catholic population has gone down to 20%, but yet 20% of the schools are Catholic. The Catholic Church provides as a major health provider. So even though in some cases practice might go down, the papacy and the Pope in particular is such a recognizable global figure that their voice and their role commands attention, even whether one agrees with it or not. But I would say, you know, it was one of the things you always had to advise ministers on, because sometimes they'd come over lobbying for things and the Vatican would say, we will get back to you. And they would come out saying, well, that's good. And I said, no, I said, because they didn't define when. And the timeline here could be centuries. That, you know, the church has seen, they've seen everything. And that corporate memory is immense, and their depth of knowledge. So, you know, we don't know that secularization is on a path dependency. You've had periods of secularization in the past, and you have periods of renewal, and religion plays very different roles. And indeed, you know, you look at some of the most atheistic regimes like the Soviet Union, and you look at what the conversation we've just been having on the role of the Russian Orthodox Church. So it's back to that thing that religion does matter.
That's probably got time for one more question. The fact that there are 183 representatives, I mean, that was, I think, probably be a surprise to people. Based on your time there as ambassador to the Holy See, does it function in a way as a sort of alternative UN with that? I mean, do you have interactions with your fellow ambassadors to try and sort things out, or is it all sort of focused towards?
It's fascinating because so a lot probably depends on the ambassador. I always see the function of diplomacy, or the function of being a diplomat or an ambassador, is not necessarily to spend your time with your friends. It's actually to get to know the people who are from the countries where there is a difficult relationship. And probably because of my own background in Northern Ireland, understanding that sometimes critical key links can absolutely be a vital communications mechanism for peace or a breakthrough to occur, even through the most difficult of days. So I could think at that time, you know, there was a group of us who were very friendly, including, might I add, the late Tim Fisher, who was Australia's first resident ambassador, and an absolute gem. And so Tim was at the table. This was a group of us. There was the Pole, the Russian, the French, the Cypriot, the American, the Irish, myself, the Dutch. And that was a wonderful group where we had our interests as nations, but actually when you were off duty, friendship counted. And we would discuss things, and we weren't all rushing back you know, to write up reports saying X, Y, and Z said this. You knew when somebody was giving you an official message and you knew not, but it provided the degree of elasticity that if you wanted or needed to pass a message, you could. And I think the Holy See, you spent a lot more time together, especially at religious ceremonies, than say your secular colleagues would do in a capital like London. And I sat beside the Russian ambassador for my first 3 months. And when I was leaving, we would move as in seniority at St. Peter's Basilica at these formal masses and the ceremonies. And the British ambassador has to wear a sword. And I had never worn a sword before in my life. So it used to constantly dig into the back of his leg as I would get up and down. And he said to me, you know, he said, normally I don't say this to colleagues. He said, but I'd be glad to see the back of you. And you just, you know, there could be periods of tension in the relationship. But actually, I do think your analogy with the UN, where ambassadors are spending a lot more time together, actually allows you to get to know the person. And in my view, diplomacy, yes, you do oil the friendships, but actually true diplomats should be reaching out to those where there are fundamental differences, because that can be an absolutely vital bridge when needed.
Absolutely. Well, that's a very good note to end on. So it brings us to our allotted hour. Francis, thank you so much for your time, shedding light on many aspects of the Holy See, which we would not have known, but we really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your views. So thank you so much.
Alistair. Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Right. And thank you to the audience for your interest and your questions.